Before we get into this video about today's breaking news of the escalation in the Near East, it looks like all-out war now between Israel and Hezbollah. I want to prefix this by saying that I think the approach that Hezbollah and Hamas take towards their own civilians is utterly callous. What I mean by that is they fire rockets into Israel, knowing the military power Israel has, knowing it's backed by the United States, the most powerful country in the world. They do so with such a disregard to Palestinians and Lebanese civilians. So no one should be under any doubt that these are ruthless, brutal terrorist organizations that really don't give a damn about, certainly not about Israeli civilians, but not about the civilians they would purport to represent either. That's a very important point because, I've been very critical of Israel recently, and I stand by everything I've said. I do think the civilian death toll in Gaza is repugnant, and I also think Israel has committed war crimes. Recently, IDF soldiers were seen throwing bodies over buildings, presumably deceased, but nevertheless, there's this idea that it's good versus bad is overly simplistic. Um, there's a lot to say here, so I'm not going to go into huge detail, but I'm going to cover some of the basics as I see it. Big escalation today. Um, Up to 500 people have been killed in Lebanon, which, to put that in context, is almost half the total number that died during the 2006 war. So it's, the bloodiest day in the Near East since the October 7th attacks last year, the bloodiest single day I'm talking about. Um, Dramatic images in Lebanon of people fleeing to the capital, but how safe is Beirut? The thing is, Lebanon's a very small country. It's even smaller than Israel. So where is safe? The Israelis have said that they sent out 80,000 phone calls, um, and I've no doubt that they did. But the question is, where do these people go? I mean, Lebanon's a very small country, and where is safe? In Gaza, they gave the same sort of warnings, and people were bombed to the so-called safe havens that they went to. So, um, the Lebanese people are not going to feel safe. Um, as I understand it, Israel's objective with this is so they can return the 60,000 Israeli civilians who've been displaced from northern Israel, i.e., so they could go back to their homes. They've been displaced for months on end. Um, so far, there's been no casualties from Hezbollah rockets into Israel, but clearly this has escalated badly. Um, and there's been a lot of sort of forerunning to this thing. The pager attacks. Um, of all the things that have happened in the Middle East in recent years, that's one of the most bizarre in the sense that it was, I mean, leaving aside all the ethics and morals of it, it was a hell of an operation. And I'm not saying that flippantly. To rig up devices and have thousands of them explode simultaneously, and 37 people killed, thousands injured. Now, it's true that the bulk of them were Hezbollah fighters, but there were civilians killed and injured as well. And it doesn't take a genius to see that if you have a situation where these fighters, these terrorists, Hezbollah are terrorists, where they're mingling among the civilian population, where they're going about their daily business alongside ordinary Lebanese, that's going to put people at risk. If they've got it in their pocket and that explodes, they're going to be severely injured or killed. But anyone in the vicinity could be injured as well. It's this idea that it's just oh well, it's only targeting Hezbollah and only Hezbollah will be injured. It's delusional. It's just common sense that other people in the vicinity will also get it. Um, Lebanon's a sovereign nation, you know, and that's a point that makes this different from Gaza. Gaza is under the Palestinian Authority, but of course there is no Palestinian state. But Lebanon is a sovereign nation. Problem is in Lebanon, it's a complete breakdown of order there. The Lebanese government's very weak. It has no power over Hezbollah. Hezbollah is backed by Iran. So they vowed revenge after the pager attacks. as for those major attacks, I don't think anyone seriously believes Israel's claim that it wasn't behind them. I mean, even pro-Israelis know that Israel was behind this. It's just really doesn't take a genius to work that one out. Supposedly, they were manufactured in Hungary, which in turn came from a company in Taiwan that said they lent their name to a Hungarian company, but they weren't responsible for the manufacture. So there's been a lot of scrutiny of that. Apparently, there's been a businesswoman in London associated with it, but to have thousands of devices exploding simultaneously, this would have taken a hell of a lot of planning. And purely in terms of the technical side of it, it's a very elaborate um, plot. Um, but it's a very concerning situation because inevitably there's going to be a lot of civilians killed in this coming war. Um, and it's horrendous. I mean, there is a siege mentality with Israel. It's surrounded by enemies, and it has to be said, whereas Israel gives warnings, Hezbollah doesn't give warnings to Israeli civilians. And I do think were it not for the Iron Dome, there'd be a lot more Israeli deaths. But what I find hard to stomach is people who make light of this thing. I've seen memes out there that sort of trivialize the situation, and they're mocking the fact that Hezbollah terrorists have been killed and injured. Okay, well, Hezbollah is a brutal terrorist group. There may be some sort of dark parody there, but I just don't see anything funny about the situation when civilians are at risk. I saw a little girl, her family were obviously going to Beirut, and she was kind of dancing in the street outside her car, and it's just sad to see that she obviously was oblivious to what was really happening. But the adults were looking scared, they were getting children out of school. Lebanon is a country that's been through really, really, really rough time in the 2020s, the economic collapse, the the Beirut blast of 2020, and it's I think it's a very depressed place, really. And now this, um, I think this conflict is probably going to be deadlier than the 2006 conflict if today is anything to go by. Um, but there is angles to look at it. I mean, Israel does kind of get blind support from the United States and to a lesser extent Britain. Right now, relations between London and Tel Aviv are not particularly strong. Publicly, we still support Israel and we're still allies, but the Israelis have made it clear they don't like the fact that we've scaled back some of the arms. Now, I take the view that why should Britain and America be the only countries in the world that give Israel blind support? Other Western countries that have supported Israel, including in arms, such as Germany, France, the Netherlands, Canada, they've all scaled back or completely halted arms whilst the severe human rights abuse is going on in Gaza, and there are concerns about alleged Israeli war crimes. Now, frankly, I do not entirely trust Israeli propaganda. I think that they probably take more consideration regarding giving civilians warnings than the likes of Hamas or Hezbollah. But um, it is also true that there are far right people within Netanyahu's government that aren't just about the defense of Israel. They really want to see an expansion of a kind of greater Israel. I do think that mentality is there. And we know that because they've spoken about building condos in Gaza when they've swept away all the rubble. I think there's some very ultra nationalistic figures around Netanyahu's government. Um, so whilst I do blame Hezbollah, Hamas, and Iran for escalating the situation in the Near East, I think Netanyahu's hawkish government hasn't helped. And it's important to remember there are thousands and thousands of Israelis who are very unhappy with their own government. So that's noticeable. There's also something else that I would add to this, and I've covered this before about alleged BBC bias. I watched two reports on today's events, one on the BBC and one on NBC. And what's curious is the comments were quite different. On the BBC report, there was this avalanche of comments about, how biased the BBC was supposedly against Israel, and i.e. pro-Israeli comments, saying that the BBC was backing Hezbollah and other such nonsense. I didn't see that at all in the reports. But on NBC, which took a slightly different angle. They were a bit more obviously pro-Israel. There, the comments were America should stay out of this, and it was kind of anti-Israel comments. So it's interesting how there's different attraction to. It's like pro-Israelis want to attack the BBC, and pro-Lebanese, pro-Palestinians want to attack the American networks. So it shows how difficult it is for news networks to basically not get criticised, because no matter what angle they take, they're going to be criticised. I have a big problem with this idea that the BBC shouldn't even report Palestinian civilian deaths or Lebanese civilian deaths. And actually, as a matter of record, the BBC did have correspondents in Israel to report the Israeli side. They reported the rocket attacks. Um, some very experienced journalists on the ground. Um, People like Ola Giram was in Beirut, and Jeremy Bowen in Jerusalem. They're two of the most experienced journalists around. So this constant abuse of the BBC's reporting, this constant criticism of the BBC's reporting, I think is unfair, because I think what it amounts to is basically saying we want you to just blindly go along with Israel's narrative, and that's it. Just don't even question Lebanese civilian deaths or Palestinian civilian deaths. I think that's absurd. And I don't think that would be professional journalism. Now, I am still critical of the way the BBC spoke about Hamas at the beginning. I mean, in October last year, when they refused to describe them as a terrorist organisation, they just used the secondary the British government designated it as such. Um, I mean, the legal definition of terrorism is deliberately to target civilians for political gain. So I think the BBC were wrong in their approach on that. But the idea that the BBC is a mouthpiece for Hamas and Hezbollah, I think, is utterly wrong, simply because they're covering the situation on the ground in Gaza and in Lebanon. And frankly, I trust Orla Guerin a lot more than I trust some right winger who supports Israel in, in Britain or the United States, or Israel for that matter. So there is a context to this. Hezbollah is a toxic, brutal organization. And I'm not going to lose any sleep over Hezbollah casualties, but I see nothing trivial or funny about the fact that Lebanese civilians are going to be extremely worried tonight. And it's all very well saying, well, this is Lebanon versus Israel. No, it's Hezbollah versus Israel. And the Israelis will say that. Well, okay. In that case, people should differentiate between Hezbollah and the Lebanese civilians. As I gather it, the Lebanese have contempt for Hezbollah because they know that Hezbollah, through their support for Hamas, have basically brought war to them. So I do largely blame Hezbollah for this. I mean, they must have known that this constant rocket attacks on Israel would have ended badly. So it's completely callous of them to bring about this war. But if we see the same situation as Gaza, if we see civilian casualties mounting, it won't do anything good in terms of PR for Israel either. Um, and like I say, it's all very well giving people warnings, but where the hell are they supposed to go? I don't have any quick answers to this. I know there's been a lot of condemnation of Israel. Simon Harris, the Irish Taoiseach, was very scathing in his criticism of the pager attacks. So have others been. But, there is a context. Israel isn't just bombing its neighbours out of spite. There is a context to this. And I do think Israel sees this as an existential crisis whereby its very existence is threatened. That doesn't justify abuse by IDF troops, and the number of civilian deaths, particularly in Gaza, is horrendous, but it's not without context. And with that, I'm sure there'll be a lot more to say on the subject as the situation develops. That's a few thoughts. I do think that the criticism of the BBC in terms of expecting it to just blindly go along with the Israeli narrative is nonsense. Um, I don't expect the BBC to do that on any conflict, even Russia and Ukraine, which to me is frankly a bit more black and white than Israel and its neighbours. But anyway, that's how I feel about it. It's It's a depressing situation. Hundreds dead today, and yes, a lot of them will be Hezbollah terrorists, but also a lot of civilians on both sides. I mean, let's not forget Israelis have been displaced as well, and those rockets being fired at them aren't toys; they're designed to kill. It's a grim situation.